Hi, and welcome to Diversity in History, Fostering Global Mindedness. My name is Jana Cook, and I'm the Community Manager of BookShark. Today, I'm joined with April LoTempio, and she is the author of Journey to the Eastern Hemisphere. April, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. This is so great. I've been looking forward to it.
We're really excited to get to talk to you about your vision behind the book that you put together, your personal travels. But before we get into any of that, why don't you just introduce yourself to our audience and tell them a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Well, as you said, my name is April LoTempio. I've been working with BookShark for, I think, almost 8 years or so. Before that, I was an elementary school teacher. I taught for 15 years, public and private schools. I taught reading. I taught classroom at second, fifth, and sixth grade, and reading at all levels. And that was a great experience, and it was an incredible opportunity to be able to shift and use that experience into a writing career. So I've done a lot of writing curriculum, Sunday school lessons, even apps and online resources. And BookShark has been one of my biggest and longest clients. I've worked with some of the different curriculum, writing new things, revising existing products, adjusting things for different lines or different grade levels. And Eastern Hemisphere was probably one of the biggest projects I took on. It spanned a long time, and it took a lot of work, but the product is really something I'm proud of. They did a beautiful job with the publishing, and it's good to hear that it's been useful for families, that kids are interested in it. So
So, as a homeschool parent who's been using BookShark for 5 years now, I've actually been through level, which is now F, that we use Journey to the Eastern Hemisphere. And when I advise parents, I always say, hands down, that is my favorite level to do. And I've done it twice, so I can say with confidence that it is just so engaging. And as a homeschooler personally, 8th through 12th grade, and then went into college, I felt like if you didn't seek out information from the Eastern Hemisphere, just you wouldn't necessarily know a whole lot about it. We kind of get that ancient time period as kids, and then we get it again in high school. And when you go to college, you may or may not, depending on your course load. But when you take time to really delve into the Eastern Hemisphere and just cultures that are so foreign to someone like me who grew up in the Midwest and didn't have a ton of diversity where I was living, it's just exciting to be able to delve into the other countries and see what's going on. And so that was one of the things that I loved so much about Journey to the Eastern Hemisphere. So when you were approached to create this, what was kind of your vision behind the book?
well, it came to me with a pretty good structure. The higher ups at BookShark really put a lot of time into selecting the countries to be covered, the subtopics to be covered, and then even the way we looked at each topic across, so that we definitely wanted to include the geography across the board of every country that was selected, or the government. Certainly history was the biggest part. And it's interesting because you can take something that we look at now as Pakistan and say, okay, we don't have a chapter about Pakistan. I'm just picking a random country and say, okay, study this. But as you go back through history, well, it wasn't always quite that. The borders weren't the same. It overlaps with different parts of the region, and the histories overlap. So it was interesting to dive into those, even though we had outlined kind of the parameters of what we were covering. And then some of the subtopics, like some of the major world religions, and how those span countries, they span millennia, in some cases. So it was interesting, and sometimes I just had to go within that framework and go where the information led me. So if there was a lot to deal with about, in some cases, there was a lot to deal with about geography and how it influenced movement and settlement and development of cultures. And for another country, it might be totally different. It might have been all about, more about a dictator in a war and how they're affected in that way. So it wasn't, it was nice to have that structure going into it, but it was nice to have enough freedom that I didn't have to say, oh no, I can't, I can't produce 4,000 words about, this aspect of history in this country, because it just didn't fit what actually is is available or what had happened. So I did have the flexibility within each topic, um, to focus on different aspects.
It's interesting that you mentioned Pakistan because that is one of the countries that when I went through it the first time with my twins, I was in awe. I had no idea that it was created because of political and religious unrest in India. And, I knew who Gandhi was as a kid, you know his name, you maybe even know a little bit about his political ideologies and then kind of the history of and the evolution that he went through as a person. But to really delve into history alongside a book that's talking about, his influence in this region, I can't remember how many times I said to my friends, "Did you know that Pakistan
Yeah.
was created because this was going on?" And so many people were like, "I'd never heard that." And I was like, "I didn't either, but I learned it in my kids' homeschool curriculum. And we
Mm,
read this story that went along with it." And it was so impactful to me as an adult. Now, I hope it was just as impactful to my children. But if not, I know that at least they have a place that they know they've heard it. And so when they hear it again, that groove will get a little bit deeper and they can go, "Oh, that's right. We read a story about that as we were going through history of India and Pakistan." And my goodness, I mean, just things that I feel like I'm a fairly intelligent American, but that the fact that I didn't know that seems like a detriment to me personally, that wouldn't be something that is, taught.
yes, I think it's true. As Americans, we tend to be a little more insular, I think, than a lot of the rest of the world. One, because our country is so big. I mean, I can drive for 7 hours and still be in New York State. And so we look at something that is a lot of different things and we call it one thing, whereas in other parts of the world, it's much more segmented. And also our history, as our existence as a nation is a lot shorter than, the ones we looked at certainly in Eastern Hemisphere. But I think when you talk about the impact to your children, it's not so much the specifics that might stick with them. They may forget the history of Pakistan and have to rediscover that as an adult. But I think what it does is it develops their worldview and the idea that, okay, not everybody has the same history that we're used to in the United States. Other parts of the world have developed differently. They have, different history, different circumstances, and it develops that idea that not everything is just like it is at home.
And you make a great point because you think about American history being a little over 200 years old, right? And you look at China, and they have been, I mean, they're, like you said, millennia, like they've been around. And so when you put that on a timeline, and I show my kids, like, hey, here's America's history, here's the ancient
Yeah.
civilization that, and they're still there, they're still living, and still holding on, some cultures still holding on to some ancient ways, and not necessarily changing so rapidly the way America embraces change, or modern world embraces change. And so I think we have a mindset that, oh, everybody just, a new Apple iPhone comes out or new Samsung, and so we go grab it. And you have regions in this world that don't even necessarily have modern communication available, or they choose not to bring it into their culture for whatever reason. I think it's so important to teach that to kids. And that's, so again, why I love this spine that we use in level F, because it's stuff that if you don't know what you don't know. And I look at my kids sometimes and I go, do you not realize America's history is so short compared to these other countries that you could put all of Europe inside Texas and maybe a little bit of the surrounding states, and that would be the entire region with all of these different cultures. And so it's no wonder that at times it was a powder keg in this small region with all of these different ideologies being, that people lived by, and then there was clashes. I think just this idea of fostering a global mindedness to get a better worldview. Do you feel that maybe American culture is less open to that idea compared to, let's say, other parts of the world?
I wouldn't say we're less open to it. I think we're a little less experienced with it.
Okay.
I mean, I just think of the adults I know, and I would say very few of them have been outside of the United States. I mean, I live very close to Canada, so not counting a little foray into Canada, very few have traveled internationally. Very few are fluent in other languages. Um, Very few in the area I live. Very few have immigrated from other countries. Now, in different parts of the United States, that's a very different story. But in a lot of the U.S., that's the case. And when you travel anywhere else in the world, in a lot of at least the major cities, you will meet people from all over the world. You will meet people who speak 3, 4 different languages, who've traveled extensively. So I wouldn't say it's a matter of closed-mindedness or not being open to it, but that Americans just maybe aren't as experienced with it. And I hope it comes across in a very positive and accepting way, because I know, just among my friends and family, if we meet someone from Brazil, it's so special and exciting, and we want to know about it, and we think it's adorable, and are kind with them if they get some grammar wrong. Whereas, when I've traveled internationally, a lot of times like, another American,
Mm.
they're so used to it that it doesn't make such an impact. So I think in large part, from in my experience, Americans have a very positive and open-minded view, but maybe less experience with international community than a lot of the rest of the world does.
And I think just geographically is a great point as to why maybe our experience is a little bit less than other cultures,
Mhm.
because we are so large and we are encapsulated by from sea to sea and then border to border. Like you said, I can, a lot of people I know have at least been to Mexico or Canada because those are geographically close to us. They haven't been outside of North America because it's not quite as easy to do. When people go to Europe, it's like, oh, we're going to take a day trip and we'll end up in 3 different countries. Where even you could do that and you'd be hard pressed to get 3 different states in if you
Right.
were traveling in America. So I think that to make the point that it is, you're right. Not that it's not that we're not open-minded, is that we have some challenges that maybe other countries don't have to deal with as far as geography and things like that.
Right. And even as far as our textbook learning, I mean, you talked about the timeline of something like China compared with the timeline of the United States. Even if you study China extensively, like you're really getting, a 30,000-foot view at something huge. And so students who spend a year studying US history can go into a lot of detail in every era of US history. Whereas you look at something like Journey to the Eastern Hemisphere, and there's a nice big chunk of history of China, but it's really a high level view of it with maybe some few illustrative examples or details that bring it to life in a different way that you would experience American history.
So, when you have traveled outside of the United States, just talk a little bit about that, how that has increased your global mindedness in your
Oh, for
writing.
sure. Yeah, so my travels, besides the nearby Canada, I've been to South America. I visited Argentina and Brazil, and those were very non-touristy trips. My brother married a Brazilian, and they were living in Argentina for a time, and then Brazil at the time. So that was a very kind of on the ground view of how how people live, and that was my first real international experience. And then over the past recent years, I've done 3 months long trips throughout Europe. I'd say uh, Central and Western Europe, and to be able to travel slowly again was an effort to not just do Rome in a day and Florence in a day kind of trips, but get a little more into that everyday, the way people live their lives, from having to do banking and laundry and get my hair done in Greece when I no one there spoke English, and I'd explain how to do my hair color or something. And it definitely put things in perspective of how cultures are very different, but also how certain things are just so similar, and things that we have in common across the board, no matter where you go. And I've had all positive experiences traveling. I've met wonderful people, even in passing, even the people that you never learn their name or see them again, but I remember them as such a positive interaction. And as long as you make the least amount of effort to kind of conform to that culture and the expectation, rather than, me traveling thousands of miles and expecting everyone around me to cater to my my needs and my impression of how things should go. Yeah, you definitely need to be open-minded. Or, if someone comes back from international travels and said, oh, everyone was terrible and rude, and then I would think, well, maybe it's not everybody if it all kept happening to you. Because yeah, you have to be open-minded to some of the just the ins and outs of the way people operate culturally. But across the board, I mean, we have more in common, I think, than we have different.
In your experience, you said when you were there for like your month-long trips, did you see a difference in like a city that's used to having Americans come in as tourists, as opposed to maybe countryside where they don't have a whole lot of experience with Americans? Did you see like a cultural or acceptance difference there?
Oh, for sure. And I did make effort to get off the beaten path. And I was also traveling off season to some degree, and that helped a lot. I think the frustrations I would see with people, like, especially in Europe, were tour groups. They came during peak season at the most popular sites. They travel in packs. And it was difficult. It's hard you don't connect with people in that setting. They're connected with each other. But I was traveling on my own. And um, I think, yeah, I was not a special unicorn when I was, in um, at the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. I mean, they see people from all over the world in the millions. But yeah, when I was in the countryside of southern France, people really wanted to know, like, oh, why did you come here? Like, why this town? How did you find this?
Hmm.
And that was always a fun conversation starter. And they universally felt very appreciated that I would find them. And I feel the same way about my home. I live outside of Buffalo, New York, and I don't think any Europeans are looking to visit Buffalo, but there's so many great, pearls here, little Easter eggs. If you, I would always say, if you're coming to Niagara Falls, like, that's pretty much our only international gets us on the map. And I said, spend an extra day in Buffalo, like, see some of the things that we do have to offer. And I think having done that myself in their different towns was very fun. So that, when I talk to someone about my travels, I don't have the same stories every tourist who's been to the Eiffel Tower. I have the story of being dropped off in the woods with a kayak by myself and going past castles that no one I know has seen those. So that, yeah, it definitely has an impact on kind of the way you experience a place. If you get off the beaten track a little bit more.
Now, I have a confession to make. I will be 43 next month, and I have never even owned a passport. And so I'm wondering, I'm sure Google can tell me, how many Americans actually own a passport versus don't have one. And the international laws have changed over the last couple of decades. So when I went to Mexico years ago, you didn't need a passport, right? You just need a birth certificate and driver's license. And same with Canada. Now that those are obviously changed. So my passport should be in the mail shortly. I'm very excited. And people keep asking me, well, what's your plan? Do you have a trip planned? And I'm like, no, I just want to have a passport. I just want to know that It's almost like that, again, that fostering global mindedness. And my kids, this was the year that everyone got passports in my house. And it was like, we don't have a trip planned, but I want my kids to know that there is a big world out there and
Yeah.
they can explore it if they choose. Now, there's plenty of people. My spouse is not a big explorer. He is happy to be where he is at. He grew up here in Colorado. He's happy to stay here in Colorado. We typically vacation here in Colorado, but that's his bent, right? Like he is happy to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that type of personality. But homeschooling my children, never grown up, I did go to Mexico a couple times, even as a kid, but never leaving the continent. I'm so excited to give them this gift of, if you decide to travel, this is how you start. Like step one, here's your passport. But even before that, I think a way that homeschool parents, if visiting Europe is not in the budget, it's not in mine anytime soon. But there are so many ways that we can introduce different cultures, different ideas. Obviously, Level F has had a huge impact in our family. I remember when we first started it, the first book that goes along with it, which is Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. My kids would not let me put it down. They said, read
Wow.
another chapter, read another chapter. And then that author actually has a couple more books that we've gotten. And then one of the activities, it was like, choose your adventure. And so I remember we made egg rolls together, and like that was so exciting. I had never done something like that. This summer, we're actually going to try our hand at making sushi. Um, but these ideas of, you don't have to leave even your home. We were talking about, this has been a year of a pandemic, and we're going on, 12, 13 months of this, but there's so many things that we can do right here in our own homes to foster this global mindedness. It doesn't have to be, well, I can't get to a different country, so I guess we'll just keep studying American history. It's like, no, there's so many things that we can do. So what are some ideas that you can give our viewers about some things that can be done just right in their own home?
Well, I will support what you said, that it's a great idea to pursue that, whether or not you ever have plans to travel to the other countries. And I think it builds a foundation. First of all, once you have that passport in hand and you make your first trip, that's going to crack it open. Like, now you've done it, now you know how it works. You're going to want to do more and more. But do those experiences, latch onto any of those little teachable moments that spark up in the curriculum to make it an experience for your kids, whether it's making food or doing a virtual field trip or, finding out every book on that subject, because down the road that could inform travels where you actually physically can do those things, and it will be more special. I mean, anyone can go to London and follow a tour book and hit the main sites. But I read a book 10 years ago about the Endurance expedition. And so my goal throughout England and Ireland was tracking down these important historical, I saw the ship, and I went to the college that Ernest Shackleton went to and saw where he spoke. And those things are so much, now I have a much more personal experience and special to me. So I think with kids, just because right now you're doing some things at home to kind of bring the learning to life, that doesn't mean that's where it ends. That might set something off down the road, whether, it's trying out a kind of artwork. If you read about calligraphy, get online, find a tutorial video about how to do calligraphy. Spend, $5 on the low end pen and give it a shot. And, that sticks with your kids. So I would definitely look for a lot of, I know when I'm writing it, I can always feel in the back of my mind, like, oh, kids are going to love this part about like sports, food, a lot of the cultural things, art. So that section, particularly in Eastern Hemisphere, every topic has a section of culture or everyday life. So those are good places to mine for those experiences, but also pay attention to some of the history, the famous people, the famous places, battles, even the flags. I mean, your student might be the one who just latches on and then just wants to study the flags of the world and how much you can learn. It's a very visual thing. It could be an artistic thing. but there's a lot of history to that. So I think as parents, homeschool parents, like you're always wearing many hats and trying to think of that crossover. And I would say definitely let your kids' interest lead the way. But we have so many opportunities now, thanks to internet, that even if you don't know what to do, you just know, like my child thought this part about calligraphy was kind of interesting. Just put it in the search and see what comes up. I mean, maybe there's a museum in another state that has a calligraphy exhibition and you can visit it virtually, or maybe there's a tutorial video. So I think you really only need that little grain to get you started, and then it'll snowball.
We had when we were going through the first semester of level F, the first time we went through it, we were taking a trip to Chicago, and they had the Terracotta Warriors on exhibit in
In
one of the
Chicago.
museums in Chicago.
Oh,
And this is a sad story because by the time we got on the train, all these things happened. We did not get to see it. And I will tell you what, like that still hurts my heart because I don't know that I'm ever going to get to China to be able
oh
to
wow.
see these. And so anytime, our museum locally in Denver has something, like my kids kind of drag their feet on it. I'm just going to be an honest homeschool parent here. They're like, oh my gosh, why do we have to go see that? Why King Tut's, too? Why do we have to go? We've already seen that. And I'm like, no, because each time you go, you're gonna find something you didn't see before. Now, on a happy note, we did get to go see the Dead Sea Scrolls when they came through on
Oh
exhibit through Denver. And I was sometimes I think I homeschool just for myself.
wow.
I was geeking out. I was so
That's amazing.
excited. I took so long, and my kids were like, are we done yet? Are we done yet? But at one point in the exhibit, you got to go to a mock, of the prayer wall that they have in Jerusalem. And so you could write a prayer and stick it in. And, they didn't ask you what your religion was. They didn't care.
Right.
And so you got to simulate that in this museum. And I thought, you know what, I may never get to Israel, but my goodness, I got to at least, walk through the steps of what people do. And they roll up these scrolls and they stick them in the wall. And it was so amazing. So sometimes when I think my kids are just really over something that I'm not over yet, I
Yeah.
think, oh, am I just am I doing them a disservice by pulling them along but I feel like my excitement over these things, they may roll their eyes in the moment just as an encouragement to parents, but it,
Mhm.
it, it is stuff that they bring out later on in conversation years later. They'll be like, oh, remember when you took us to that thing? And they'll remember something that I didn't remember. And I was like, oh, yeah, that was great, wasn't it? So, just an encouragement to parents that you may get eye rolls, you may get, oh, do we have to go do that? But definitely your excitement, it may not be in the moment, but your excitement rubs off on your kids. And I
For
know my
sure.
kids really wish I'd bring it down from a 10 to a 2 most days, but but one day they're going to appreciate all my geeking out about history and stuff like that. So,
Yeah. And sometimes the learning comes before the experience, and then sometimes the experience happens first and later it comes up with the learning, and then they've got the background for it. And it's especially exciting, I think, when something touches on current events. I mean, some of these things you've discussed, there's a lot of current events going on regarding the Western Wall, or ownership of artifacts. And okay, you made your confession, I'll make mine. I had read about and heard about the Greek, I forget the name of them, marbles. I know it came up a lot in the news when George Clooney married his wife, and she was an international lawyer trying to get these marbles back from London to Athens, where a lot of the community felt they belonged. It was not until I was standing in the museum in Athens that I realized the marbles that I'm picturing as playthings, looking at the giant slabs of marble from the temple in Athens, and they had it all spaced out with the missing ones. And it was like,
mm,
these are the ones we're trying to get back from London. And like, I had seen them in the museum in London, but now I'm
mhm,
standing here in Greece. I can see the Parthenon up
mhm,
top, and they've outlined, where these artifacts had fit in, and here are
mhm.
the missing ones. And it just brought to life, like, of course she's fighting to get those back in Greece. Like, they have the whole puzzle. And it just didn't make sense to me at the time, but it's exciting when you can show kids that like history isn't dead. History isn't, closed book with period at the end.
Mhm.
It's still affecting our lives today.
When you start thinking globally, it really brings back how small and how connected we all really are, which to me would almost have the opposite effect. Like the world's too
Mm.
big, we're too
Oh,
far apart, we're too distant in thinking and culture and even distance. But like it's when you really start to look at it, it really makes it a lot smaller in my mind, in my experience. Have you experienced that?
um, I have, like I said, it always puts in front of me the differences, like things that are so interesting. Like, oh, I've never thought of people doing this way, but also the similarities. And I think having that global mindset and that eye for diversity forces you to dig. I mean, we've been talking about the short history of America, but it's only short as our recorded history. And even especially getting into South America and some of the ancient civilizations that did not leave as extensive a written record as we have, for example, for China and the Israelites and these ancient cultures that left so much firsthand primary sources for us. It's a lot harder. And until you dig into some of that history, you might think like, okay, before Europeans came to America, there were Native Americans, and we have like one picture, and it's like they were such diverse groups, and the way their cultures developed based on where they lived and the land, and some were very peaceful and some were very not peaceful, and they were very different things. But the fact that our record of that basically begins with kind of a secondhand accounting, and the
Hmm.
same with Central and South America. um, you're aware of that because it's like, well, wait a minute, I've studied Japan and I've studied India, and they have all these texts and all these artifacts, and here, when we look at the Western Hemisphere, it's a little bit of a different um, telling of the history. And students who have studied history and have had diverse viewpoints, I hope we'll see that and understand that we don't have a lot of those firsthand voices from so far before. Um, so yeah, I do think it makes the world seem like such a big thing. It can be overwhelming, but to me that's so exciting to dig into those and find like, okay, we have this impression of, for example, Native Americans, but dig in and study and see like like it's like an onion, you're peeling back layers to learn more and more. And I think the differences make it very exciting. Um, but it kind of grounds you, it kind of connects you to other cultures and even time periods.
And I think it's an important distinction to make that I believe when we're saying American history is short, I'm speaking specifically to the country, the organization of America, right? Like because
Mhm.
obviously North American, the continent, has a history from the beginning of time. Right.
Yeah,
And so, and maybe that's also part of expanding our minds. When you think of Japan, you think of it as a culture in an ancient area, right? You don't think of it as a country that has a short-lived history. When you think of China, it has historically it's broken apart. It's had different leaders. They've divided it differently. But you think of the region and not the government, the peoples of it, right? And so I think with America, it's so easy to say American history, but really it's speaking to the organization of the government by Europeans in America, not North American history that
yeah,
has an ancient history, just like all these other regions.
yeah. And that's something that's still affecting regions and cultures today as borders change and countries change. I've spent most of my travel time in Italy and especially Sicily, and it's strange to be in a place like that that's so old and has so much history, but at the same time the country itself is younger than the United States, and out of that has arisen different dialects. I worked so hard to learn Italian, and I was so disappointed when I got to Sicily and I couldn't understand anybody, and I'm like, but they're Italian. They could understand me. But when they spoke their local dialect, it was like a different world. And their history is much longer than the Italian nation. just the many, many cultures that have inhabited that region and contributed to that culture. Yeah, so it does, you've got to kind of look at things like, okay, are we studying this modern day version within these borders, or is there a bigger picture to the developing history and how that's affecting areas today?
Well, I'm glad to hear that we're not the only region or country in the world that has that issue, because I often wondered, even as a kid, like, why do we call it the US? Why do we call it the United States of America? Why do we call it America? Like, why? Because you do, when you say America, you're kind of encompassing like the whole land, but really we're talking about the United States and their history versus your North American history, which was here way before the United States came, and
Yeah,
so it's an interesting distinction. I think that as a kid, I don't know that I would have made that. I don't know that oh,
no,
wait a second. There's different, as you go through the historical period, it's been different things. It's been, and maybe as home educators we can do a better job explaining that than maybe it has been done for us as kids when we did social studies all those
true,
years ago.
true.
All right, April, I know that we have some viewers who are getting ready to start level F in the fall. And so what do you have as maybe some tips or encouragement for those homeschool families who are getting excited about this journey to the Eastern Hemisphere?
Oh, I would say enjoy the ride, and it's going to hopefully be very exciting. But don't be overwhelmed up front when you unpack and find that this is a thick, heavy book. And maybe you have a student who's a little more of a reluctant reader, or this is a kind of a stretch reading level for your students. This isn't a novel that is necessarily meant to be read cover to cover. It's a digest, it's a resource for learning in history and social studies. And if you look at it in pieces, I think it's a lot more digestible. And so just don't be overwhelmed. I mean, if I fed this entire text through a leveling tool, it might tell you it's high school, college level. But if you take one section of one topic at a time, what you might realistically cover in a day, with your support and the notebook and the questions, it's very manageable. So I would just say don't be overwhelmed, and that you may not cover every word in this book this year, but hopefully it'll be one that you keep on your shelf, and it can be a reference and a resource as your students go on and study some of these things, and they'll think, oh, wait a minute, we learned about Confucianism way back, let me look that up again. And it can be a resource for you in that sense as well.
One thing I love that BookShark does in particular, and we're obviously not the only curriculum companies that do this, but when we pair the literature with our history, when you are reading through, let's say, Egypt, and then you get to read a book about a character, the main character who is in a certain time period and in that region and in that culture, there is just something so
As
exciting.
a reader, it is just magic when you read historical fiction done well. From a writer's perspective, it's terrifying. I mean, I have written history and I've written fiction, and the thought of trying to make those blend and work and be historically accurate and culturally appropriate and still tell a good story, it's mind-blowing that people can get it right. But when they do, it kind of provides a context for all of that history and all that nonfiction. And when you see that dropped into someone's real life, albeit a fictional character, I think kids and adults connect to it more easily.
Well, if that's not a great plug for having literature-based learning, I don't know what is. So maybe you can kind of just give us a little sneak peek of what you have been currently working on.
Well, um, I have just finished and hit send on the final piece of Western Hemisphere. So yay! It's I believe going to feel very similar in some of the framework that we used for Eastern Hemisphere, whereas there was a lot of thought put into what do we pick to focus on, how do we zoom in. It covers not just Western Hemisphere geographically, but culturally. So some of Western Europe, is included in that, as well as North and South America. And I think it'll be familiar to homeschool parents and students who've seen Eastern, like the way it's broken down and the different topics are all still there as far as, government, economy, history. So that was really fun to work on and satisfying to get done from such a big endeavor.
Now, do
So that's
you
coming out. I don't think this fall. I think it needs a little more time, to go through all the steps of publishing, but that will be coming soon.
Well, that's exciting. I know I'm super excited for that to come out because as much as I loved Eastern, I think that Western, again, just exploring part of the Western hemisphere that I am unfamiliar with is going to be super exciting. Now, when you're writing these materials or you've worked with history, when you're looking for a historical fiction that kind of fits into the time period or the region, do you have some criteria that you look for? Just trying to give homeschool parents ideas of, if they're trying to enrich the history that they already have, like things that they
Right.
can look for in literature to help give their children that extra flavor.
Um, there's definitely an emphasis now on own voices. So wherever possible, trying to even with fiction, to hear a story told from someone who might connect to the culture in a more personal way, more firsthand way, which wasn't always the focus in the past, as far even just I'm talking about the publishing world, not just homeschool material, and what's available. And again, that that has been kind of a hard thing, especially with Western Hemisphere looking at American, North and South American history, because um, there is not such a wealth of written record. And so um, it doesn't mean there aren't good resources out there from people, who've done their research, but you might have to dig a little harder for some of those things. But um, any you know journals or associations that are giving awards are also starting to look more, and not just like, here's the best fiction, here's the best nonfiction, but like, here is the best historical, here's the best female voices, here's the best, and so those accreditations can help guide you towards something that's a little better. Sometimes like historical societies and museums and things like that, they do their own um, I don't want to say just awards, but those are good places to look because they'll do a very good vetting job. So it's not just library associations and things like that. Um, but those would be good sources to look to if you're really like, if your student loved, learning about the ancient Aztec, where can you go to learn more? Those might be some good sources, but I would just say keep digging. They're out there, and maybe if come across something, you find it and it's kind of a bummer, that's a good learning opportunity. Like if you have a student who's obsessed with Aztec culture and they're reading a book saying, wait a minute, they would never do this, they don't worship that way or whatever, like, great, you found that, you knew that, like, write a letter to the publisher while you're at it. Even just like connecting with the book, all my years of teaching, there'd be years I would read aloud or study a book with my class, and it was like a home run out of the park. And a few years later, I dust it off and try it with a different class, and it just fell flat. And it's like, kids are different, and their experience with literature will be different as well.
I definitely always tell my kids they do get a certain number of vetoes throughout the year. So as long as they start a book, they can read the first 50 to 100 pages, tell me why they're not connecting with it, or what their grievances with it. They're allowed like 2 vetoes a year. I'm like, okay, fine. Then I'm not gonna make, there's things that we need to do in order to create discipline and structure, but then because we have this beautiful arena of homeschooling that we have we can customize, right? So I like to show my kids that they're like, hey, that you didn't connect with that one. Didn't really do anything for you. Fine. But at
Yeah.
least give it a try, give it some time, and then give me a reasonable reason why it's not working for you. And then we can move on to the next one. Just so that it's kind of like try your vegetables, right? Like, oh, it's not always, it's going to fall flat sometimes. And I have twins, and one will love it and they'll connect with it, and the other one's like, "Nah, not really doing it for me." So it's amazing that we have an opportunity as homeschool parents to be able to do that with our kids too.
Yeah,
That
and
we
I think
do really.
especially if parents are new to homeschooling maybe, or, uncertain in that first year about taking that jump and relying heavily on the curriculum, like eye on the prize. Is your goal to check off every book in the curriculum list from BookShark, or is your goal to create thoughtful readers who love to read and can evaluate books and pursue their own interests? So you're right, within some parameters of like, we've got to get some things done, have some structure. Yeah, what is your goal? Why are you choosing to homeschool and use a literature-based curriculum? Then you want your kids to be discerning readers.
Absolutely. And we keep coming back to this phrase of lifelong learning, that we
Mm.
want our kids to not just be able to remotely answer, dates and times and people when they're reading through history, but become excited like I am at 42 about different opportunities that arise for us, that we can always be learning. It doesn't ever stop. So, April, I
Yeah.
want to thank you so much for being here today. I know our audience was really excited to get to hear from you. And hear about the book and how it came about. And we hope that you'll come back and we'll get to talk about your new project sooner than later.
I
But we
hope
appreciate you
so.
taking the time. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you. And I look forward to being back again. I look forward to helping contribute to a lot more with BookShark and hearing feedback from parents and addressing questions. This was great. So thank you.
We want to thank you guys for joining us today. We'll see you next session.